In my lecture, I want to ask the question how we assess the ways in which the Habsburg Empire was involved in the European project of colonialism. Most standard accounts tell us that Austria-Hungary since 1867 acquired no overseas colonial empire, nor did it compete on a broad scale with any of the big European powers on issues of colonial policy. In the 18th century, the Habsburg Empire did attempt to compete with global trade and colonial networks of Britain, Spain, Portugal and France, initially by accident through acquisition of the Ostend East India Company in 1715 after the War of Spanish Succession, but the company was disbanded again almost immediately in 1731. In the 1770s, an East India Company based in Trieste was founded again, and its activities were to be supported by establishing military presences first in the Delagoa Bay in what's now Mozambique and later on the Nicobar Islands, but the former was lost to Portugal in 1781, and in 1784 Denmark took over the latter. Austria's lack of a navy fleet made a role on the global stage nigh on impossible. Following the Congress of Vienna in 1814 and 1815, where the seeds for later imperialist and colonialist domination in the 19th century were sown, Habsburg foreign policy and diplomacy were strangely absent from the European initiatives. The body of literature on colonialism during the 19th and 20th century therefore rarely mentions the multi-ethnic empire along the Danube whose rulers had for centuries concentrated on territorial expansion into Eastern Central Europe and the Balkans. Sometimes this supposed abstention from colonial intervention is constructed as an important element of present-day political identity in Austria. Around 1900, Austria's genuine destiny was merely to be found in a so-called civilization mission and research rather than in actual colonial activities, an indication that although Austria had itself not established colonial rule, Austrians had, whether as traders, venture capitalists, academics or travellers, been involved in the exploitative activities of other global powers in the 18th, 19th and early 20th centuries, but in a supposedly more humane or even humanist manner according to some critics. Of course, the very idea of a neutral, civilizing academic mission to amass knowledge of the world articulated in such humanism is inseparable from the colonial discourses of imperialism and Orientalism, as most famously described by Edward Said. Said is interested in identifying the cultural practices of hegemony that constitute colonial socio-political processes. Imperialism means thinking about, settling on, controlling land that you do not possess, that is distant, that is lived on and owned by others, according to Said. Thinking, in this sense, thinking about, settling on, here means that there is a sense of performative enunciation in literature, science, politics, popular culture, etc., of other places and people, mostly as ignorant, barbaric and passive, or the likes, and that these performances simultaneously construct and justify a need for imposing order in those places symbolically. According to Said, European culture was able to manage and even produce the Orient and other colonial locations. Taking the late 18th century as a very rough starting point, Said describes science and knowledge as far from neutral. They are rather a part of a corporate institution for dealing with colonies by making statements about them, teaching about them and settling in them. Austria's self-image is a beacon of enlightened knowledge against the barbaric backwardness of other non-European peoples and their lands, but without the excesses of its European competitors like Britain, needs to be seen in these contexts. And then, given that the battle was long since lost in the 18th century, the attempt in Austrian history writing to turn that into a positive story also obviously needs to be questioned. And this brings me to the image on the opening slide, the infamous Meinl logo of Julius Meinl AG, best known for the tea and coffee products that carry a version of this logo to the present day. Much depends, namely, on what definition of imperialism or colonial involvement we use. Do we only mean direct political control of territories in the Americas, Asia, or Africa by a European nation-state, a formal definition of empire? Or do we pay attention to the formal and informal strategies like hegemonical relations and trade or ideology that find their place in political, economic and cultural phenomena, as Said's model would encourage us to think? Thus, a critical discussion of Austria's involvement in imperialism might, for example, involve examining the role played by Austrian or Austro-Hungarian individuals in the context of overseas expansions. And we can see this in the Murnane, which points towards colonial trade and racism at the core of what became one of Austria's most internationally successful conglomerates. It even expanded into corporate finance in the 1980s and the 1990s, before running into difficulties in the economic crisis around 2008. Astonishingly, the company adopted this logo as late as 1924. Previously, it had used a sailing ship, recalling the colonial trade routes of its most important Kolonialwaren. The logo was tweaked in 2004 in the belief that the silhouette and the slightly raised head somehow did away with the fundamental racism of the brand. Although an initiative started in 2007 called Mein Julius made it clear that this was not the case. In short, this example encourages us to look towards informal networks and discourses of colonialism in Austria. Similarly, questions like whether Austrian travellers, missionaries and traders behave differently to similar people from other European countries that did have colonies are important. An obvious case here would be the Jesuit missionaries and their lay staff, whose efforts were a factor in establishing an Austrian colonial presence in southern Sudan or in the Kenyan highlands. But there are also numerous examples of medical, legal, financial and military experts in the services of the French, Belgian and German administrations in Egypt, the Congo and Namibia. Less obvious, of course, are the academics and professionals involved in producing maps, reporting mineral deposits, collecting anthropological or ethnographical material, often in violation of ethical or even legal standards, or those involved in studying local languages, including scores of so-called Orientalists in the Ottoman lands from Turkey to the Levant to northern Africa. Another possible approach is to take our lead from Robert Musil. In the famous Kakanian chapter of Mann ohne Eigenschaften, Musil ironically recalls, man hatte keinen Weltwirtschafts- und Weltmacht-Ehrgeiz. Die Worte Kolonie und Übersee hörte man an wie etwas noch gänzlich Unerprobtes und Fernes. But later, this absence of overseas colonies is linked to the confused and confusing state of this Austria as the Mittelpunkt Europas in the novel, the Mittelpunkt that resulted from Habsburg's expansion into the eastern territories of Hungary, the Balkans, Transylvania, the Banat and Galicia. In Ihrem, so in the city of Brno, where Musil's main character is growing up, in ihrem Wesen lag, wie sehr wohl wusste, etwas heimatlos Koloniales, ein ältester Kern deutschen Bürgertums, der vor Jahrhunderten aus slawischen Erde geraten war da verwittert. Musil seems to suggest that Austria's real colonial legacy needs to be studied in relation to these eastern territories. And in the rest of the lecture, I want to highlight the fact that Austria was not a colonial power in the narrower sense. What's possible, though, is to show how symbolic, rhetorical and discursive strategies based around ethnic difference and familiar from colonialism were deployed in Austria to impose systems of cultural and, indeed in the case of Bosnia, political hegemony within its own territories, what is being known as internal or inner colonialism. In the following, I will firstly address Austria's potential colonial relationship with the Balkans, and Bosnia in particular, before secondly looking at a particularly spectacular case of colonial hegemony surrounding a vampire epidemic in 1725 around Kislova and Medvegia. And this will show how, in the formative period of the Habsburg Empire as a modern state in the 18th century, and hegemonic colonial discourses were developed which we can consider as quasi-colonial and imperialistic. We do need to be careful to acknowledge many crucial differences between the systems of exploitation and disempowerment at the core of this overseas colonial project, and the political representation and sovereignty of the Habsburg Eastern Territories, even in the early 18th century, however. Of these, only Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was occupied as a military protectorate in 1878 and annexed in 1908, was not afforded any political representation. In all other cases, pre-existing local political structures were adapted into the new power constellations, with local nobility and aristocracy occupying places in the royal and imperial parliaments and diets in Budapest and Vienna. On the other hand, the Balkans historically occupied the status of Austria-Hungary's Orient, in a discourse which Maria Todorova has powerfully discussed as Balkanism. Not only did both the Balkans, Turkey and Egypt, once belong to the same Muslim Ottoman Empire, we can also see a similar binary logic of civilization, barbarity, activity and passivity, enlightened rationalism or superstition, begin to emerge in Austrian accounts of the regions on the Balkans. Taking into account the relative level of political representation afforded to the Balkan region within the Habsburg lands, we need to consider Austria as a quasi-colonial power, engaged with what has been called inner European colonialism. The term quasi-colonial is not meant to relativize Europeans' violence and inequalities of colonial activities elsewhere in the world. I use it only insofar as the Habsburgs too expanded into culturally, linguistic and ethnically foreign territories in order to dominate and exploit them economically as part of Austria's imperial history. And in a sense, this seems counterintuitive, because we've grown so familiar with the narrative of Austrian modernization under the flag of the Habsburg Empire as being a story of hybridity, and accepted the theme of unity and diversity as an identity of the lands. The idea of the Habsburg myth of unity and diversity goes back to Claudio Megri's 1963 book of the same name, and takes Musil's description of the mitteleuropäische K und K multinational state as a programmatic antipode to the nationalist and centralist state ideologies elsewhere in Europe. This is the Doppelmonarchie of Geheim- und Kommerzienräte that brings communication infrastructure, bureaucracy, education and embourgeoisement to the furthest reaches of the empire, irrespective of ethnic or religious belonging, most obvious in Metternich's motto of Einheit in der Vielfalt. Representative of this interpretation of Austrian national identity is Ernst Josef Görlich's Grundzüge der Geschichte der Habsburger Monarchie in Österreich. Görlich appeals to this as a relatively peaceful and inclusive top-down form of political and social cultural identity under the umbrella of the Habsburg monarchy. This culminating in the collective national identity of the Hofratsnation, quote, in der auch Angehörige der Südostvölker, Serben, Rumänen, Bulgaren, Magyaren, Slowaken und Ruthenen als gleichberechtigte Mitbürger aufgenommen wurden und sich eines weit besseren Loses erfreuten als die unter der Leibeigenschaft ihrer ungarischen Grundherren lebenden ungarischen Bauern. This national myth of Austria as a state of bureaucrats is much older, however, and it can be traced all the way back to the 18th century, and has frequently been seen as one of the founding narratives of Austrian statehood. The bureaucratization had actually already been initiated in the 17th century through the creation of the Hofkanzlei in 1624, and it was continually expanded throughout the early and mid-18th century. Traditionally, this period following the wars with the Ottoman Empire and the respective peace treaties of 1699 and 1718, followed by the War of Spanish Succession around 1700, and the instigation of Maria Theresa's reforms after 1740, has been viewed as the origin of a modern state, which intended to incorporate and homogenize its various peoples and communities by virtue of bureaucratic and legal means. This all culminates in Joseph II's bureaucratic apparatus as the mainstay of a new feeling of Austrian statehood. According to this typical account, the dominant national identity emerging from the Enlightenment in Austria was a form of Staatsfrömmigkeit. But this bureaucratic ideal, driving a unified Austrian identity, was by no means free from ethnic discrimination or hierarchies. Musil describes the settlement and annexation program in Eastern Europe in terms of a Kakanian colonialism, that brings the values and trappings of civilization and systems of political hegemony, repression and ethno-chauvinism along with it too. And even Claudio Megri speaks himself of a kulturelle Kolonisation Osteuropas, indicating a factor that post-colonial studies have long acknowledged, that a purely formal, political, civil, a civic, administrative or economic description of imperialism and colonialism alone is insufficient. We also need to acknowledge the narratives of difference, exceptionalism, othering, hegemony, and ultimately domination that enable them to be created as artifacts in the first place. This is true of Austria's Slavic constituencies in the Balkans more broadly, but of course it's particularly relevant to Bosnia, given its later occupied status. One example of such identity of politics and imperialistic cultural hegemony that emerged in the Balkans in the 18th century is the Serbian vampire. This is notable because it coincides with both with Austria's first sustained military and political expansion eastwards, and with the establishment of the practices and the narrative of Habsburg's bureaucratic nationalism under Maria Theresia and later Joseph II. In 1725, a strange report reached the Commission for the newly acquired Eastern Territories in Vienna, in which the local administrator in Belgrade, Frombald, requested advice about how to deal with a series of strange deaths around Kislova in Slavonia. A recently deceased man going by the name of Peter Plogojevich was suspected to have returned from the grave to kill several of his neighbours, upon which the remaining villagers disinterred his corpse in the presence of Frombald and drove a stake through its heart before finally burning it. Surprisingly, Frombald's report seems to have initially raised few eyebrows in Vienna, perhaps because of the fact that he referred to a standardized local practice which was relatively common during the Ottoman administration of the area, what he calls Untertürkischen Zeiten geschehen. Frombald's report was soon filed to the archives, where today's historians, anthropologists and scholars of literature have rediscovered it as one of the first officially documented instances of actual vampirism in Europe. These events also give rise to a dissertation by the Leipzig scholar Michael Ranft, which has been described by Klaus Hamburger as, quote, richtungsweisend für die spätere theoretische Auseinandersetzung with vampirism in the Enlightened Discourse. Ranft's text seems itself to have attracted little attention until a second wave of vampire reports emerged in the area around Medvede, also known as Medvedja, on the border with the Ottoman Empire in 1731 and early 1732, when it was translated and published under its better-known German title now of Traktat von den Kauen und Schmatzen der Toten in Gräbern. This time the interest of Vienna seems to have been greater, not least because the military was unsettled by the events. A fact-finding mission was conducted first by the Austrian epidemiologist Glaser and later by the military surgeon Johann Flückiger, whose report Visum et Repertum subsequently became the core text in non-fictional accounts of vampires in Western Europe. Whereas Glaser and Flückiger, perhaps even more so, delve in depth with the medical details of these events, Ranft pays scant attention to any possible reality of vampirism. Instead, he declares this plague to be the result of nervous affection among the locals and suggests climatic reasons for the lack of decay in the corpses. To all intents, Ranft's treatise transforms the vampire into a product of the locals' fantasy, shifting the focus of the debate from the anthropological interest in local traditions, even if this interest by no means extended to accepting these traditions as legitimate, towards a general condemnation of the superstitious folly of the southern Slavs as a backward people. The stories about vampires, on the other hand, emerge from actual local or native stories, and this suggests agency on the part of the subaltern groups on the ground, the southern Slavs. The only reason we are aware of the stories, however, is because the networks of military, medical and bureaucratic surveillance put in place during the expansion into the new lands in the southeast record them as such. The cultural patterns of people on the new eastern border of a Western Europe, currently at that point redefining its own social, cultural and political structures according to the powers of reason and rational logic, are thus slowly elided from view. The internal cognitive structures knowledge and concepts around practices of vampirism, according to which the locals dealt with death and trauma, are ignored in order to adopt an external critical position by which the cultural patterns are transformed into superstition. Now, while it may seem counterintuitive, precisely those cultural practices which enabled Austria to create this national bureaucratic identity through its embracing enlightened universalist principles in education, economics and administration, namely cultural transfer and the dispersal of knowledge, as well as knowledgeable experts across existing national and political borders, may on closer inspection be seen to produce a consciousness of difference, leading ultimately to various nationalisms and conflicts in the territories by the end of the 19th century. In the case of the Serbian vampires, it becomes possible to see how Western concepts of rationality and superstition become sutured onto Slavic folklore in order to create a figure of uncanny difference against which Austrians define themselves as rational, whilst also enforcing these very principles of reason. The ensuing journalistic and scientific spectacle of the vampire served to create a stereotype of Slavic ethnies, in particular the Serbs, as backward, uneducated, irrational and uncanny. The Slavs in Serbia are plainly now part of the Austrian Empire, but equally apparent is their strangeness and their distance from the core values and norms of the Austro-German-led state. Topographically, the vampire was of special relevance to Austria in this regard, as it was, to all intents and purposes, restricted to areas either on or within the new military border running from Slavonia in the south to the Bukovina in the northeast. Both these questions point towards an experience of the otherness of non-German people within the Habsburg Empire, and importantly, they do so in a period which has been termed the Mutterboden des modernen Österreich-Begriffes, in which the Habsburg monarchy underwent the process of state building and modernization, leading to the development of a uniform central state, according to Prometza. From this point on, the figure of the Serbian vampire maintains a revenant presence of its own in Austrian and Western European encounters with the Balkans, ghosting through various medical, philosophical and scientific discourses throughout the 18th century and on into the 19th century. As Novosadko concludes, quote, für die zeitgenössische Wissenschaft markierte der Vampir daher nicht nur die Grenze zwischen Zivilisation und Barbarei, sondern auch jene zwischen Aufklärung und Unvernunft. This stereotype has enjoyed a dubious longevity, becoming firmly established by 1747, when Sedler's Universal Lexicon referred to the newly acquired lands to the southeast of Hungary as well suited for farming grain, if only, quote, die Einwohner selbiges Recht zu bauen nicht zu faul wären. The discussions relating to the events in the predominantly Slav regions in Bosnia and Serbia, and Moravia slightly later in the century, reveal a hierarchy of dominant and subordinate ethnic and national identities, with the educated military physicians, rationalized bureaucracy and Christian values emanating from Vienna becoming posited as the social and religious norms in opposition to the superstitious and deviant behaviour in the regions to the east. The aggressive processes of inclusion and exclusion along ethnic lines, which become the hallmark of the later 19th century imperialism, may thus be identified in a nascent state in early Enlightenment discourse. As such, the transformation of the vampire from folkloric figure, expressing multiple traumas and transnational migrations, into a blood-sucking ethnic monstrosity, helps us to develop a post-colonial perspective on Austria-Hungary from its 18th century origins. The patterns that we can identify around 1730 continue to circulate in literary, journalistic, artistic and political text relating to the Balkans throughout the 19th century, and finally manifest themselves in the discourse surrounding the occupation of Bosnia-Herzegovina in the 1870s. Despite the official narrative of Austria-Hungary's unity and diversity, the post-colonial perspective enables us to identify shared patterns of imperialism in Kekanian's process of modernization, as those that can be found in the global projects of colonialism emerging from Western Europe in the same period. Austria-Hungary may not have established itself as a colonial power in formal terms, but in its discourses of Balkanism, with figures of alterity such as the Serbian vampire, we can indeed make a case for rereading Austrian literature and culture from a post-colonial perspective.